cool. So I hope you really like that. I find it just really interesting, and the guy seems funny, and yeah, but just really cool seeing how quickly that happens, and actually seeing those triggers and the venom being released from that jellyfish or from those tentacles. So we're going to talk about two different classes. So remember, we go domain, in this case Eukarya, kingdom, which is Animalia, phylum, which is Cnidaria, and then the lowest level we're going to talk about in this class is the class level. And the first class we'll talk about is Skyfoo ZOA. So Skyfoo ZOA. This class is essentially all the jellyfish. There are some exceptions, but for simplicity's sake, most of the jellyfish that you think of or that you've seen belong in this class. This is an example. You may have seen on the beach, just these little pockets of jelly. If there is a jellyfish bloom where there's millions of jellies, sometimes they wash on shore. And so when you see those, they can still sting you. So keep that in mind. They're tentacles and still have those cnidocytes, still have those nematocysts, so they can still sting you, but effectively they are dead. Or this being one of the largest jellyfish in the world, you can see just the sheer amount of tentacles this has. But again, pretty much all of our free-floating jellies are going to be in the class Skyfoo ZOA. Now, when we think of jellyfish, we think of the Medusa form. We think of the free-swimming form. But what's fascinating is that's not the only form. Jellyfish actually have a polyp form. And you just probably have never seen it because it's usually attached to the ocean floor. So I'm going to talk about their life cycle, but a very, very simple life cycle, just because it's very fascinating. So we'll start with the jellyfish that you and I know. This is a regular old jellyfish. It's a diploid organism. It creates egg and sperm. So here's a male jellyfish. So a male jellyfish, it makes sperm. And then we've got a female jellyfish creating this egg. So male and female, nothing weird. They meet up. Now these are just released into the environment, right? So when you're swimming in the ocean, you're surrounded by sperm and eggs. Just food for thought. So eventually, this egg and sperm meet each other and they create a zygote. Now this zygote is going to land somewhere. And typically it needs to land on a harder surface, but that doesn't matter. It lands somewhere. It doesn't form into a jellyfish. Instead, it forms a polyp. So you got a male and female jellyfish. They make the gametes. The gametes come together and they make a zygote. But instead of that zygote just making a jellyfish, it makes a polyp. So this would be an example right here of sexual reproduction. You have two different individuals that are making gametic material that then come together. So that is a sexual example. However, when that zygote lands and forms into a polyp, this polyp literally makes jellyfish. So in this one right here, this structure is literally going to start popping out baby jellies. And it, excuse me, could be popping out, hundreds, if not thousands of them. It's really fascinating. It's like this little polyp machine that's just literally spitting out jellyfish. That is an example of asexual. So this is like they had a child, and then that child started cloning itself. So it started out as sexual reproduction. This polyp is a brand new individual, has a blending of genetic material. However, then it's going to duplicate its DNA multiple times over and over and over again, and it's creating all of these jellyfish that have the same exact genetic material, which is why it's referred to as asexual reproduction. This would be the equivalent of saying like a guy and a girl make a baby, and then that baby starts making clones of itself. The baby making clones of itself is asexual reproduction. But that baby to begin with was sexual. We did make this new organism that is a blend, but then it starts cloning itself. And in this case, it's cloning inside of this structure to make little baby jellyfish. And then those jellyfish, all of them are going to be either male or female, because again, they're cloning themselves. So these line the ocean floor, and they're just popping out all these baby jellyfish. Go watch this video. It's actually kind of adorable, all these little baby jellies. But this kind of gives you an overview, and that's as complicated as I'm going to make that life cycle. Just know that it starts off sexually, they grow a polyp, and then they reproduce asexually to make more jellies. So pause here, watch this video that should be popping up, and then come back. So I told you, right? Like super adorable. I've been trying to find information, but I could only find estimates where 50 to like 1,000 jellyfish could be made from one polyp. But they're all genetically identical, and as you saw, they're incredibly small, so more than likely a lot of them get predated upon. But that's okay, you just need 1 or 2 to survive. So that's the class Skyfoo ZOA. Now again, this class, all these organisms have the cnidocytes and nematocysts. All these organisms are diploblasts. So all the characteristics of the phylum Cnidaria are seen in the individual classes. The other class that I want to talk about is Anthozoa. So with Skyfoo ZOA, we saw both a polyp and medusa form. However, organisms found in the class Anthozoa only have a polyp form. There's not some weird life cycle thing where at some point in their life they're a jellyfish. That's simply not the case. These organisms, from the moment they are conceived to the moment they die, stay in the polyp form. So this is going to include things such as our sea anemones over on the right, as well as our corals. When people think of a coral, they usually don't think of it as a living organism. You think of this huge coral reef, but there's actually tons and tons of essentially small sea anemones, but they're corals, small sea anemones on them. Now, corals release a substance called calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is essentially what shells are made out of. So if you've ever hit a coral reef or touched coral, it feels really, really hard because it has this calcium carbonate skeleton underneath of it. But not a skeleton like our skeleton where it's inside the living organisms. It's more of these little corals make calcium carbonate and release it below them. And so essentially they're building layer upon layer upon layer of calcium carbonate. And then on the outermost layer, that's where all the coral exists. So it's not like you can just take a saw and cut the coral reef in half and you'd see millions of coral in between it. No, it's coral at the very top and then calcium carbonate that's been formed over decades, centuries, maybe even millennia. Now it's made of calcium carbonate. If you remember, some of our sponge species also had calcium carbonate in their spicules. And this is where we think that we made the jump, or I should say how Cnidarians evolved. We think they evolved from our sponges, but particularly the sponges that had calcium carbonate spicules. There are some sponges that are mainly spicules and not that much spongin, and they actually look quite a bit like these coral structures. But they do have those choanocytes and they do water filtering, which is why they're not coral. But scientists think, well, maybe they had this base and I don't know, choanocytes started evolving and they started getting better adapted to maybe catch their own food without having to do this water filtration or something. So we think this calcium carbonate is kind of giving us an idea of maybe these calcium carbonate sponges were kind of the jumping stone first to corals, and then corals being a jumping stone to our jellies and our sea anemones. So that's kind of that link there, and that's why I had on the sponges slide that calcium carbonate in red. But not all sponges have that calcium carbonate. We think those other lineages kind of stayed as is and didn't really contribute to the evolution of more animal species. So that's where we're going to end. So we covered 2 phyla today. We covered our sponges, the most primitive, and then we moved our way up to Cnidaria. So now that you've watched this, make sure that you took really good notes. If not, you can watch this again. But then go ahead and complete the review quiz on this information.